Assalamu alaikum dear students, and welcome to the 42nd session of the KIPS Distance Learning Program Current Affairs Newspaper Roundup session. Today we are going to see how and to what extent are there various hurdles in the future peaceful settlement in the Afghan crisis. Naturally, this question is very important to Pakistan and Pakistan's national interest because Pakistan's neighborhood has been in the influence and under the constant guard of conflicts, terrorist activities, wars, and that is one of the main reasons why Pakistan hasn't been able to realize its potential. So any prospect of peaceful settlement in Afghanistan is a welcome gesture in the case of Pakistan. So the prospect of peace and perhaps a political settlement in Afghanistan arose after the US-Taliban peace deal that was signed and announced on the 29th February 2020. Naturally, this deal was brokered by Pakistan and its successful diplomatic efforts. Prior to that, the Trump-Imran Summit that happened in 2019 was actually a reward for these efforts, because Pakistan's efforts and Pakistan's diplomatic influence over the Taliban is one of the main reasons why the prospect of peace in Afghanistan has become real, and there are a lot of hopes that are pinned on it. So in this deal, one of the critical requirements for the process to move forward into the dynamic and the most important phase of intra-Afghan dialogue was the release of political prisoners and prisoners of war by both the Afghan government and the Taliban regime. The Afghan government held 5,000 Taliban prisoners, whereas the Taliban had in their captivity 1,000 Afghan government prisoners, and this was one of the main conditions upon which the Taliban were adamant on before there could be any question of intra-Afghan dialogue. However, in the beginning of the process, immediately after the peace deal, Ashraf Ghani and the Kabul government actually refused to give up all those prisoners because it thought that it was giving up its most important leverage over the Taliban too easily for too less concessions. However, after consistent pressure by Pakistan and by the American foreign policy experts, notably the American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Ashraf Ghani agreed to release those prisoners, and he did that in a phased process where he released all but 400 prisoners. And on the future and on the fate of those 400 prisoners, Ashraf Ghani was very adamant that he is absolutely not going to release them because according to him they were threats to international peace, to regional stability, because most of them were involved and indicted in very high profile violent assaults on many important targets, including Western targets. And out of the 400, 40 were actually sentenced to death and waiting for that in their prisons. So the question of last 400 prisoners has been very important, and a major hurdle in the Taliban coming onto the table with the Afghan government to initiate what is being called as Afghan-led and Afghan-owned intra-Afghan dialogue, which might lead to a intra-Afghan peace treaty leading to the establishment of a post-invasion, post-American force Afghanistan status quo, which might bring stability not only to Afghanistan but to the greater region as well. But that is a long-held dream, and that is a very difficult dream to accomplish. So one of the indicators of how this dream is difficult to accomplish is that the release of prisoners has been such a contentious issue, whereas in the original peace deal that was signed between America and the Taliban, it was supposed to be just an agreement for trust building exercise. But this exercise, the release of prisoners, actually points toward a greater problem, which is a very stark mutual trust deficit between the Taliban regime and the Afghan government, and this would perhaps prove to be the biggest hurdle in a future settlement scenario. Ashraf Ghani only agreed to release the last 400 prisoners while also giving all his traditional warnings about them after he convened a national lawyer jirga, which basically ruled in the favor of releasing those last 400 prisoners as well in the interest of the greater Afghan peace process. So let's look at what this trust deficit is going to entail and what kind of realities the new setup in Afghanistan is going to face, which might prove to be too difficult to handle. So first of all, obviously there is the question of what kind of government and what kind of state setup would come into being as a result of intra-Afghan dialogue and peace process. I mean, the Kabul government wants to retain the current presidential form of democracy and the ensuing constitution that was framed by the United States of America in the first place, and it wants the Taliban to basically adopt that as well and integrate into the present system, whereas the Taliban are bent upon reviving the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is something that the global community, the international community, is not very averse to, and they do not want Taliban, will not allow Taliban to re-establish that, because according to most experts it would once again become a breeding ground for international terrorists, and Taliban government would once again bring a draconian their interpretation of Sharia into the Afghan society, thus undoing decades of progress that has been made in human rights and specifically in women rights and women empowerment. So this is the number one most important question, because the Taliban have clearly stated that they will not compromise on their demand to recreate the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan as it was before the American invasion in 2001 after 9/11 attacks. The second question, like I just mentioned, is the question of women empowerment. So ever since the establishment of the Kabul government, the democratic government, the presidential form of constitution, compared to invasion Afghanistan and the Taliban regime, women have achieved much greater freedoms, much more role in society, and much more empowerment than they did before. Which is why international experts, international community, countries all around the world, and the women strata in Afghanistan are very concerned about the potential motives of Taliban to return to a pre-invasion Afghanistan with the same kind of curves on the movement, on the freedom, and on the right to basically agency that the women had before the American invasion, which was near to nothing. So they were relegated to a second-class status. They were protected by men. They could not leave their house without men, and they could not leave their house without completely covering themselves, and a number of other restrictions, which to some extent the Kabul government was able to ameliorate. But those progress are under threat. The government and the women feel that the Taliban are not conducive to those kinds of reforms in Afghan society. Thirdly, the rise of extremists and terrorist networks and organizations in Afghanistan. We have seen the consistent rise of the Daesh, the Islamic State in Khorasan, in the last couple of years, and that has proved to be a precarious situation and created a lot of national security threats inside Afghanistan and also in Afghanistan's neighborhood, and created a sort of regional alliance of terrorist networks that poses significant threats to the national security of all regional countries. And in a post-settlement Afghanistan, the most important question would be how to eliminate the ISIS and its affiliatory bodies, which are constantly creating mayhem and violence in Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. In this case, I believe that the nascent Afghan government, if a peace resolution is successful, perhaps will not have the capacity to exterminate the ISIS network. The Taliban might have, but a new government might not, because there might be too less of a consensus on the issue. Which is why the role of regional countries in the elimination of terrorist networks and extremism in Afghanistan would be required, which further complicates the matter naturally, because each of Afghanistan's neighbors have their own interest in Afghanistan, which they would pursue, and once again a complex scenario would be created that could potentially lead to more instability. Fourthly, the problem of drug and human trafficking in Afghanistan is very dense, and nearly 80% of the total opium that is cultivated in the world is cultivated in Afghanistan, and then it is exported to the rest of the world through smuggling routes through Pakistan and Iran largely. And it is a big problem for Afghan society, because majority of the poor who are engaged in agriculture basically grow opium, because that is the most lucrative cash crop and the only source of livelihood for them. And many millions of Afghan do that. So how to eradicate and root out this evil from the Afghan society is a big question that no one has any answer to right now, and it will certainly prove to be a hurdle in the Afghan peace process and the future of any post-settlement government in Afghanistan. In the same breath, I think that the issue of human trafficking is also very difficult, which is directly linked to the third problem of terrorist networks, because terrorist networks traffic human beings, especially young boys, to add to their own arsenal of young jihadis so that they can conduct their activities, which is a major problem because naturally it robs these youth of their future, prosperous future, which is essential for the development of a country, especially like Afghanistan, which has suffered decades of conflict, mayhem, and constant destruction and catastrophe after catastrophe. And finally, the fifth and most important issue in this peaceful resolution in Afghanistan is going to be the fate of more than 4 million Afghan refugees spread all over the Afghani region, prominently in Pakistan, which hosts 2.5 million Afghan refugees, and Iran, which hosts 1.5 million Afghan refugees. So the most important question for a new government in Kabul, a post-settlement government, would be how to ensure the safe and voluntary repatriation of those Afghan refugees back to Afghanistan, and more importantly, how to integrate them into a new Afghan republic, create sources for their income, and accommodate them into the economy, social and politic body of Afghanistan. That is a major hurdle. Billions of dollars are required to make that possible. The collaboration of international organizations, United Nations is required, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, in order to help those refugees regain their dignity and their homeland back in Afghanistan. So these are the 5 important challenges that really no one really has an answer to. Everyone realizes them, but everyone also at the same time is silent about them. We have not talked about these publicly in the media. The leaders have not pointed to these problems either on the Afghani side or Pakistani side or even on the American side. However, there is still some hope that problems will be resolved, because recently our foreign minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi met with Mullah Muhammad Baradar, who is the lead negotiator from the Taliban side, and now our Prime Minister Imran Khan has also invited the Chief Executive of Afghanistan, Dr. Abdullah, to a constructive session, a constructive dialogue on the future of Afghan peace process. So let's hope these men can get together and form some kind of sustainable solution in Afghanistan that addresses all of the 5 problems that I have just mentioned. Thank you very much for your patience. Take care. Allah Hafiz.